Today's episode of the podcast is supported by The Economist. Now, Alex, did you know that The Economist is about far more than just economy?
Yes.
Look, and for the people watching now, you can see it really is beautiful, isn't it? What is the front cover today?
This is from the 29th of June edition. That's basically like a Jenga tower.
Did you know, Alex, that if you text Tifo to 78070, you can get a free print copy of The Economist?
I did know that.
Why? Because we've done this before.
Because we did this last week.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Did you know that it helps readers prepare for what is going on in the world around them? A fact that you are going to ably illustrate for us now, which is by talking about an article in this, which we were going to talk about anyway.
Yes. So, this is an article from the United States section of this edition.
Put it down.
What do you mean, put it down?
I hate the States.
Oh.
I hate freedom.
Yeah.
What else do I hate?
Apple pie.
I hate apple pies.
Yeah.
And I hate dusty roads.
Okay.
And that's why I don't live in Margate.
Rattlesnakes. So this article is called Better Play, Lesser Pay, and it's about the US women's national team, and it's a really, really good, clear, quick explanation of the current lawsuit that the women's team have brought against the United States Soccer Federation.
We talked about this a little bit beforehand, and what I like about it is there's a lot of... to put it bluntly, there's a lot of crap spoken around this particular subject, and this piece in particular, it strips a lot of that. It just deals in the facts, doesn't it?
It deals in the facts.
Yeah.
So,
which is what Tifo does.
Essentially, what it says, basically, and this was written before they won the World Cup, but it's anticipating that might well happen because they're the best team in the world. So basically, the disparity in pay violates the Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. It's got some numbers around how much men and women within the two respective national teams might expect to earn in terms of friendlies.
What is the disparity?
So, if the women's team were to play 20 friendlies, if each team were to play 20 friendlies over the course of the year and win them all, the women would receive $99,000, whereas the men would net $263,000.
Okay, so that's quite severe, isn't it?
So that is a pretty big disparity.
And I know this is an argument made before with the USA, but particularly when you take into consideration the disparity in quality of the women's team versus the men's team, i.e. the women's team win the World Cup, the men's team are total...
win the World Cup again.
Rubbish.
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, this is the point that the article gets to, but what I like about it is, as you said, it just makes very, very clear what the arguments are, what the possible defences are, who the burden of proof rests with, which is the United States Soccer Federation. And I think after the World Cup, and this is a hugely charismatic and exciting American women's team, and there's like Ashlyn Harris's Instagram stories are absolutely hilarious.
There's things to like less though.
Sure.
I didn't like the tea thing.
Okay.
I'm
fine.
a traditionalist.
Okay.
The
point is,
don't go near the tea.
The point is that this article cuts through all of that kind of brouhaha that surrounds the issues in terms of the personalities, in terms of whether you like Megan Rapinoe or whatever, and it just says the facts are these, and these are the things to consider, and this is the likely outcome.
I mean, whether or not you like Megan Rapinoe should have very little to do with how much...
Rapinoe? Is it Rapinoe?
Rapinoe,
it's probably Rapinoe,
it is
actually.
Rapinoe.
Yeah, that's my bad.
Whether or not you like her is kind of, you probably shouldn't factor that much into how she gets paid. My thought on this particular issue, and we've had this conversation before, it is a different conversation to whether women's club football should pay the same wages as men's club football. That is an entirely different scenario, and there's conversation to be had there.
Yeah.
But this is not the same as that.
No,
at all.
This is not the same as it, because very, very bluntly, the women's national team and the men's national team have the same employer. And therefore, by default, that employer has a statutory obligation under civil rights legislation to pay its employees equally irrespective of gender.
And but they represent the country as well. They're not representing well, in some cases but they're not really representing a private organisation. They're representing a public body.
Yes, that's true, although I think that's a separate argument. The argument with club football is always that because of sponsorship and revenue, the disparity exists because there is not as much money within the women's game at club level. That is true. Now, obviously, there are things that may be changing around that, and the success of the World Cup and the engagement with it may drive up revenue, and therefore clubs may be able to increase what they pay their stars. However, with a national body, it seems to me that there is literally no plausible argument that says that men and women should be paid differently when it's a single employer and they're doing exactly the same job. And like you say, that argument is more clearly delineated when the women's team is so much more successful and so much more interesting and appealing than the men's national team.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But that's not the reason why they shouldn't be paid equally because they're better. They should be paid equally because they're doing the same job.
Yeah. Okay, well, listen, as we said at the beginning, The Economist is about far more than just economics and finance. It also covers a range of subjects from world politics and business to science, technology, arts, the environment, and even sport. Yes, sport.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in more stuff than just the sport, if you are interested in the sport, there is plenty of it. It's of a very good quality. I should mention as well that the copy that Alex is now showing in front of the video is not a copy that they gave us for free. It is a copy that Alex purchased himself before this agreement was even in place. So that should tell you something.
But there's an article here about Erdogan and Turkey, which is a subject dear to our hearts after we did that video where we
absolutely
talked about how he uses football. So there's loads of kind of nice tie-ins and crossovers here.
And it's been a source of trusted intelligence for over 170 years.
Which is almost as long as America.
It's for the kind of person who never stops asking questions and wants to know why the world is the way that it is. I mean, I read that like I was making fun of it, but that's because when I read things about myself, I can't help but be self-deprecating. Yeah? Did you like that? But seriously, for your free print copy of The Economist, do text 78070 Tifo, the word Tifo. Text that to 78070. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I am Joe Devine, and today's episode is another in the Sensible Transfers series, in which we'll be discussing the Premier League's newly promoted three teams, Aston Villa, Sheffield United, and Norwich City. And I'm delighted to say that I am joined by Ali and George from the Not the Top 20 podcast, whose expertise in Football League far outweighs my own. So I'm so pleased to have you here, because otherwise this would have gone terribly wrong. Ali, welcome.
Thank you. We're very happy to be here.
George, welcome.
Exactly the same, yeah. Delighted to be here, so cheers.
A lot of people, when they say Not the Top 20 podcast for the first time, stumble on their words. It's quite a tough one first time round, and you've either been practicing it.
I practiced because do you have the? Do you not have the? The Not the Top 20? Not the Top 20.
We're happy with either,
happy with
to be honest.
NTT20 pod.
NTT20.
Yeah.
Our acronym, yeah.
That sounds like a sort of weird cricket league somewhere. And it puts me off, guys, I'll be honest. So, but I think we're going to start with Aston Villa, purely because they have bought so many players. And we have a question from a listener, which I thought might be a nice one to kick us off. N17 asks, do you think the Fulham-Aston Villa recruitment comparison is lazy? N17 is, of course, referring to the fact that Aston Villa have spent close to £100 million already, although it must be prefaced with the fact that a couple of the players were on loan there last season, right?
Yes.
So what does that tell us, guys, about what Aston Villa will be doing next season, or in terms of the amount of business they've actually spent? Is the comparison with Fulham lazy?
It is lazy, yeah, but it's an obvious one to make because of the business that Fulham did last season. But if we look at what happened in their relegation campaign, I think there are a lot more problems than just the recruitment side of things, although they did obviously spend a lot of money and it didn't go particularly well. But for Villa, they were in real trouble after promotion, where in terms of contracted players, there were very, very few that they had because of the loan signings were so important that they made. A lot has been said about the importance of certain players last season, mainly by myself, such as Jack Grealish. But you look at someone like Tyrone Mings, who came in January, and the impact that he had on their defence was arguably greater. You also add in the fact that Dean Smith came in and got them playing a different brand of football, which all of these players were recruited for and bought into. Suddenly you had a squad that didn't resemble anything like the team that had won promotion at Wembley. So having to bring these players in was very important, but also improving on them as well. You look at someone like Anwar El Ghazi, who's come in on a permanent transfer, having played most of last season on the wing in the Championship. And whilst he was an important player for them, he didn't tear it up as you'd expect a Premier League class winger to do so. And so getting these players in for continuity, but also adding to that with quality, I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think the key is to banish this suggestion that it's the same as Fulham, that they're doing a Fulham. And those comparisons are obvious and easy to make. I think this is a positive thing for Villa, something they had to do, a necessity, and impressive organisation to some extent as well, because we've seen many teams who win the playoffs in the Championship. You've obviously got about a 3-week, well, everyone else has got a 3-week head start on you. The other two teams who have been promoted, they know that they're going to be in the Premier League and they can sort of plan their budgets and plan their business accordingly. Villa, obviously, the massive difference between revenue of being a Premier League club and a Championship club, as they would have been if they hadn't won the playoff final, and they would have lost their parachute payments that season as well. So it's a huge difference, and that's why I'm very impressed the business they've been able to do in just over a month, really. And as George said, absolutely necessary. Because they otherwise wouldn't have had a team to play on opening day. But the key thing to also recognise is it doesn't mean that everything's brilliant and they're going to be a Wolves, a mid-table side. They just needed these players and they've acted quickly. So far it looks good.
Okay, let's have a chat about some of the players. The most expensive is Wesley, who's a centre forward coming in from the Belgian league. Have you guys seen him play before?
We've all seen clips, I think, as you do when players sign that you haven't seen much of. But we asked a few questions from some guys who know kind of the stats side in Europe a bit better than us, and I think he stacks up pretty well on the data side of things. My one concern here is that in losing Tammy Abraham, Aston Villa have lost a huge goal threat. And from what we've seen and read, Wesley isn't necessarily one who's particularly prolific. He looks to be more in the mould of someone like Jonathan Kodjo rather than Tammy Abraham, where he pulls into wide areas very well and will kind of run a defence ragged without necessarily being that poacher in the box. So it seems to me like they still need a goal scorer, but in Wesley they've upgraded a position that's important. And as I say, at 22 years old, he's a good age to improve further.
The role of strikers is really interesting when you move up from the Championship to the Premier League, because everyone knows that there's this sort of pool of prolific Championship strikers over the last decade or two who pretty much guarantee you 15 goals in the Championship, and many of them for many, many years. But very few of them have made the step up to Premier League football and continued scoring. I mean, Callum Wilson's done absolutely fantastically with Bournemouth. And I think one of the issues is, we're going to probably touch about it on all three teams here, you do have to make some changes to your style of play. You go from being the dominant team in your division to being probably in the bottom 10% in terms of quality, in terms of technical ability sometimes. And that means a lot of difference in terms of how the matches play out. You're not going to be creating as many chances. You might need a few extra bodies at the back. And what you sometimes find is these guys like Tammy Abraham, I'm not saying he wouldn't or won't score goals in a defensive Premier League team, but he struggled at Swansea, a team that just couldn't really create him the sort of chances that he thrives on. And if they're not getting and taking those chances, sometimes these guys lack a little bit in terms of all-round play outside of just pure goal scoring. And I think Wesley, it seems like he doesn't have maybe the poacher's instinct of Abraham, but he might offer a little bit more, give the defenders a little bit more to think of outside the box, where Villa are going to be playing a lot of their football most likely.
Yeah, okay. Perhaps this is a good time then to talk about what the type of football that Villa actually play, because there are some stylistic differences between the three clubs that are coming up. Broadly speaking, what can we expect, do you think, to see from Aston Villa in the Premier League next season? And do you also think they might have to make some concessions for their type of play also?
I think at the top of this, it's important to say that all three teams came up playing a different brand of possession-heavy football. And so naturally, now they're playing in the top tier, they're going to have to either really stick to their guns, which would be difficult to do. I mean, we saw Huddersfield struggle massively when they tried to maintain that kind of level of football against better opposition, or they're going to have to change the way that they play. Interestingly, with Villa, is we often saw after Dean Smith came in, the games in which they struggled was against a low block. You look at the West Brom playoff games, for example, which were arguably their two worst performances in the campaigns, and they really struggle to break teams down. Whereas if they keep the ball from deep, which is what they did under Smith a lot of the time, for defenders very happy in possession, you had the likes of McGinn and Grealish dropping deep as well and picking the ball up. With that space in behind, that's where they became dangerous. And again, against Derby, a game in which they saw very little of the ball in the playoff final compared to the rest of the season, it was in those areas where they were able to really hurt the opposition. So in that respect, I think that Villa are the one team who maybe could be suited by the change in style they're going to be facing when they come up now, because I think they'll relish playing on the counter.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned. I'm not quite as sold on that. I mean, Smith is, as British managers go, fairly continental in the style that he's always looked to impart. All of his teams that we've covered have been possession heavy, whether that was Walsall in League One, Brentford in the Championship, and then Aston Villa when he took over. The difference between Steve Bruce's Aston Villa and Dean Smith's Aston Villa was like nothing you've ever seen, really, in a succession of managers, and that went down very well with the Villa fans, because it is, aesthetically pleasing, or conventionally so, because there's a lot of short passing in it, and he wants that sort of thing. I am a little concerned because the makeup of their midfield, especially last season, was Conor Hourihane at the base, with McGinn and Grealish in front, and those two we think are fantastic players who will easily make the step up to the Premier League. But I think the general feeling is, and it looks like they might have made some moves to sort of combat this, that they might need a little bit more steel at the base of midfield. But then again, maybe you lose a little bit of that passing quality that Hourihane has. So it's all about making compromises when you go up now to the Premier League. Yeah. Some teams do it better than others. I'm a little concerned they might be a bit leaky, put it that way, because Smith's team's always very good going forward, not always that good at the back.
But it's interesting looking at the players they tried to get in for that holding midfield role. I mean, Calvin Phillips was the first one who Leeds fans and Leeds United, and I think Calvin Phillips were all desperate to stay at the club because of the impact he had there last season in that role. And now it looks like Douglas Louise will be coming in, who of course has work permit issues at Man City, which means he can't play there, but seemingly will be fine if he goes to Villa. A seemingly brilliant season last season in La Liga. And
how does that work on the work permit visa issues? I would have thought if
you're going to have to get a different guest for that, I think.
I can only pass on one thing I've seen, but I must admit I haven't put in the calls. No hard-hitting journalism to get to the bottom of it. But I think there's a suggestion that essentially Aston Villa, in order to get a permit for him to play, almost have to make a promise of sorts that he will play a certain amount of games or a certain percentage of the minutes, which of course Manchester City could not make those sorts of assurances.
Okay. You mentioned Brentford there, and of course one of Villa's signings has been Ezri Konsa, centre-back. Will you tell me a little bit about him? Because Brentford, I suppose, have managed to make a living over the last half decade or so, making very astute signings and then selling them on, and Konsa appears to have cost Villa £13.5 million. Will you tell me a little bit about him, the sort of player he is?
Yeah, so Brentford have made circa £10 million profit on a player that they bought just 12 months ago. They signed him from Charlton, who are in League One, a really highly rated academy product, like so many others off the Charlton conveyor belt, like the likes of Ademola Lookman and Joe Gomez as well. And Joe Aribo, of course, has just moved to Rangers. So Konsa's always been, throughout his sort of youth career, just the absolute standout, whether it was playing in central midfield earlier on and then at centre-back. He's one of those players that no one doubts that he has the potential to be an absolute Rolls-Royce defender, because he's very, very good technically. He's got, he's all the sort of things that scouts like in young defenders, good size, ability to fill out and get a little bit stronger. So all the potential attributes are there, I think. And this is a bit of a ripped off from a bit of Football Manager parlance, but but I think the current ability and the potential ability, there's still a bit of a gap there.
Okay. Is he likely to be starting?
This is the thing. I don't think so. It looks like they're trying to get a chap called Engels in. Interestingly, I note that John Percy reported that Dean Smith tried to sign Engels at Brentford last year, which... So even though we don't know much about Engels, we would say that'll probably be quite a good signing, because it won't have been Dean Smith who tried to sign him for Brentford. They have a recruitment team that, while they all work together, he would have been coughed up by some other very, very smart people in that Brentford recruitment team. So I don't think Konsa will be the starting centre-back, but there's plenty of scope for minutes, and I do think he'll develop into a really good player.
Okay. The other player to talk about is Jota from Birmingham as well. Would you give us a little bit about him?
Another ex-Brentford player as well.
Is he really?
So he is, he was playing under Dean Smith a few years ago. He is a technically brilliant footballer. I think the move to Birmingham was one that quite clearly didn't work out for him. He was still one of their stand-up performers last season, playing off the right-hand side. He's not a winger who's blessed with searing pace, but it's his technical ability that really sets him aside. And I think when he left Brentford, we were of the opinion that he was one of the best players in the Championship. As I said, the move to Birmingham, he didn't really excel there. He played in a pretty poor team with some managerial difficulties, shall we say. Constant churn of managers there, and you do feel like, as much as Birmingham fans will hate to hear me say it, this is a move that looks to suit him far better, playing under a manager that he knows very well, playing in a team who will look to keep the ball down and play it and play to his strengths. If you think last season they had Albert Adoma on the right hand side, you have to say that's an immediate upgrade. So he's a player that I'm personally really excited to see him getting a chance in the Premier League. I think it's come a couple of years later than I thought it would have done, but as I say,
he's also the oldest, I think, of their recruits so far. And Transfermarkt says that the average age of arrivals is just over 24, which you would think, when we think about bulk transfer businesses, is a good progressive thing to be doing. Are you, either of you, worried at all that there might be a lack of incoming experience, or is there a sufficient experience within the squad to be to sort of bridge the gap between the Championship and the Premier League?
I think it's a concern. George and I definitely lean towards, recruiting young players being the way forward and the best way to run your club. And Aston Villa have not been hadn't been a very well run club for upwards of a decade. They're dropped down the Premier League from being an established top half team to always battling relegation, finally getting relegated. And they didn't do a very good job dealing with that relegation. I mean, the fact it took them 3 years to get back up again is actually, to my eyes, a failure. But in the last year or so, with new owners who run a basketball team in the States, an NBA team, they wanted to go down the more modern route with a director of football or a sporting director type thing. So everything's kind of starting to stack up with a bit of a different vision, a bit more modern way of going about things. But you're right that there will be a lot of fans who will be very concerned that maybe the experience and the grit and some of those intangibles might be missing, because they lost, I think, 14 players from last season. Some of them with loans, but players like Glenn Whelan and Mile Jedinak, these were
the old guard.
They were the old guard. They weren't playing particularly well, but they had a lot of experience. So
you don't know how much the impact on the dressing
exactly
room.
How much importance do you put on it?
Personally, I love having older people around. It makes me feel very comfortable and safe. So I worry about these young players. I really do, guys. You mentioned the base of central midfield before. Let's have a think now, if we can, about areas in the Aston Villa team that we think might be obvious areas that could do with improvement, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I think up top still. I mean, even with Wesley coming in,
is there more money to be spent up top?
I'd have thought so. I mean, they've been linked to Neil Maupay, who's another Brentford player,
right?
Who'll know Dean Smith very well. But he is someone who has proven over 2 seasons at Brentford that he's a natural goal scorer. They do not want to lose him, and there's also interest from Sheffield United as well, which I think feels like it's closer to being the deal if one does happen. But it just seems to me like if you look at the team last season, someone like Grealish doesn't get enough goals that his ability suggests, and you can't rely on him to do so. The same arguably with McGinn. From wide areas, again, El Ghazi's not necessarily a prolific goal scorer. I don't think Kodja, we can rely on him to be a Premier League class. You're relying on a new signing from Europe. So someone like Maupay, who would come in and I think does just guarantee you, if you're creating the chances, he will score goals. And maybe someone like Jared Bowen as well from Hull, who plays off the left-hand side, scored 22 league goals last season in the Championship, can just provide a bit of impetus and a bit of and another scoring threat as well. So they're the EFL guys I think could come in.
I mean, the obvious other thing is the goalkeeping situation is still very much up in the air. They've had a strange time and an unsuccessful time with goalkeepers. They had Sam Johnston on loan 2 seasons ago. He was very good, and then he ended up with West Brom last season. And I think they probably played 3 or 4 different goalkeepers over the course of the season. And they kept buying new ones. Nyland in the summer, then Kalinic in January. Neither of them stuck in the team at all. Fans and coaching staff clearly losing faith in them. Ended up finishing the season with Jed Steer, who's kind of been a bit of a career backup in various different places and actually performed quite well. But, unfortunately for people like him, he did perform well, but fans are quite quick to sort of say, thanks very much, but we don't think you're Premier League class. So I don't think he'll get much of a chance, to be honest. So they're in the market for a goalkeeper. We know that. Names like Tom Heaton being bandied around. that would make a lot of sense. I'm sure that he wouldn't command a particularly high fee. He's 33, and I'm not convinced if he's going to be Burnley's number one. But brings a bit of experience, fantastic shot stopper. That would make a lot of sense to me.
Okay. I would be a little bit worried listening to the two of you, because in the same conversation we've heard that Smith he's a great attacking coach, maybe a little bit wobbly going backwards, but also that Aston Villa perhaps don't have enough goals in the side. Yeah. Those two things in combination don't sound like a Premier League side that is certain of staying up next season. So I suppose the final question to ask you both on Aston Villa is, are they going to stay up?
I think it's going to be really hard with all these three. You look at the Premier League table now, and it's very tough. Unless if you take away the promoted teams, there's no clear candidates for relegation. You can make a good argument for all of them. Maybe Newcastle being the one now, if Steve Bruce does take over, who look like they in a far worse position than they were at the back end of last season. I think the Villa, of the three, I mean, I think they're seen to be the most likely to stay up. I don't see it that way. I think the investment that they've put into the squad means that it's really important they do stay up. And I think the reason why maybe we might sound a little bit pessimistic is because I do think there is more money to be spent, and they are going to be buying more players. I think we'll certainly see a goalie coming in. As Ali said, I'm sure there'll be more attacking reinforcements as well. I just can't imagine they're going to lose Abraham and rely on the players they've got at their disposal at the moment. So I'm not pessimistic, but I don't think I'm as optimistic as the general public seem to be.
Yeah, pretty similar. I mean, we don't put a huge amount of scope into the so-called size of a club and how recognisable they are, or how big their history is, and things like that. And in the EFL, that's always a hot topic of conversation and a topic of debate amongst fans as who's the bigger club and all that sort of thing. Trying to get past that, because I think that probably feeds into why some of the wider public who don't follow the EFL as closely might see Aston Villa and think, well, they're a bigger club than Sheffield United and Norwich City. That's not me saying that. That was why we had those, and therefore I'm sure they can re-establish themselves as a Premier League club. But we definitely don't think it's going to be that easy. And they won the playoffs, less time to prepare. They probably weren't. I think by the end of the season they were probably about as good as Sheffield United and Norwich. They finished the season really strongly, but there wasn't much between all three of them. So it's going to be a big battle between, to be honest, all three of them, because as George said, it's difficult to pick which current Premier League club is going to have a shocker and might take up one of those spots without putting up much of a fight.
Okay. Ali's visual air quotes cue there is a good time for me to tell you that you can watch the podcast on YouTube by searching for Tifo Podcast. If you do watch today's podcast, you'll see that Ali has commandeered the good camera. And there's a bit of sponsorship there from Diet Coke, of course. Tifo's big sponsors, Diet Coke. And George has the camera that makes him look ill. Yeah, so thank you for taking one on the chin there, right, George. Let us move on, if you don't mind, to Norwich City. And I'd like to say at the beginning of this that half of my family are big Norwich City fans. Nice. So do be very nice. Also, the caveat of the fact that I haven't watched Sheffield United or Aston Villa for the last couple of years. I watched Norwich a couple of times last season. In my experience of visiting Carrow Road in the past, it's always incredibly boring and they're poor. But I'm trying to remember who I watched them. I think it was QPR towards the end of the season. And Norwich
thrashed them.
Yeah, they thrashed them. And Norwich even had a red card, I think, and still scored two goals afterwards.
Yes, Buendia was sent off, wasn't
That's right. Yeah, he was. And I don't think I've ever seen them play so well. And of course, my opinion means nothing in that regard. It's totally out of context, and I haven't seen the other games.
You went to Carrow Road for the game that was on TV, though.
Yes, I like to do that. I like to buck the trend, George. I'm not a TV guy. I don't fall for these modern rules. But Norwich haven't done quite as much business as Aston Villa. I'm having a look now. A lovely goalkeeper, Ralph Farman, who is on loan, though, right?
Yes, it appears to have come with a loan fee, which is always a suggestion that he's serious business, and he's obviously a bit older as well. I think we're probably looking at the same website here.
Are we both looking at transfer marks?
Yes, we are.
Lovely.
The 30-year-old Schalke goalkeeper. The Bundesliga is definitely not my strong point, but it's a name that it's a recognisable name. He's not coming to.
It's a lovely name.
He put it this way: we know he's not coming to be Tim Krul's backup and sort of help him warm up before the game and then sit back on the bench and that's your lot. I think Krul was, in many people's eyes, Norwich's weak link last season, which is a little surprising given he's the most recognisable name on their team sheet for for a Premier League fan looking at their squad. But he was a bit of a weak link, and a lot of the XG stats for goalkeepers that have been released in the last few weeks have suggested that he was actually pretty below par and below average Championship goalkeeper. So that would have been an obvious area of recruitment for Norwich. And, you said yourself, they haven't done a huge amount of business compared to Aston Villa. Again, the necessity wasn't there, or rather they certainly don't think it's there. I think this is a popular way of going about things for their fans. You talked about the atmosphere, which hasn't always been good at Carrow Road in the last 5-10 years. They've yo-yoed somewhat and had some good times, some bad times. Genuinely, and I do believe this, that the whole atmosphere and the whole club has been completely transformed, essentially.
This is the loudest I'd ever heard it this season.
Yeah. And it's on a footballing level with the structure being put in place and the big hire of Stuart Webber, the sporting director, who gets a lot of praise, and rightly so, because everything he's touched so far has turned to gold with Huddersfield and now with Norwich. But what they've been able to do to sort of reconnect with the fans as well, and all of that translates into atmosphere in games, really, and sort of general good vibes between fans and the club, and that's what they've got now. So I think there was so much love for this team that's won them promotion because it was so unexpected at the start of the season. So many young players, which is very rare. I think 3 or 4 academy graduates playing key roles. And it would have been, clearly, to my eyes anyway, the wrong thing to do to sort of tear it all up and start again. So it looks like they're more or less, I think I'm right in saying, George, sort of sticking with what they have. There's been some new contracts for some of the players. And everyone's believing in the Canaries this year, that's for sure.
Well, a question off the back of that from Juha Seitala. Do you think Timo Pukki, will succeed in the Premier League? That's the big question, I suppose, for Norwich. Talking about goals as it relates to Aston Villa, Pukki had a phenomenal season in the Championship. Is he going to make the step up?
It's such a hard question to answer because...
Do say yes, though.
I'm not going to say yes.
Oh, dear.
I think so. I mean, Timo Pukki won the Championship Player of the Season last season, deservedly. He's been given a new, I think, 3-year contract at Norwich, deservedly. He scored so many important goals, so many late goals that were so crucial to their promotion, and scored loads of really good goals as well, technically brilliant goals. Yet there is still this nagging feeling that it was just a bit of a purple patch. You look at his career as a whole, and he's never been particularly prolific. You look at his time up in Scotland. I mean, normally if a player can't score in those leagues, I wouldn't really back them to score in the Premier League. We've seen players who can't score in the Premier League go to Scotland and score hatfuls. So I think that
what if it's the magic streets of Norwich City?
I mean, maybe it is.
What if it's the kind-hearted Daniel Farke as well? Yeah. Such a lovely man.
But we also look at kind of the underlying data of Norwich last season, and they scored, I think, 20 more goals than their XG4 suggested they should have done.
You can definitely keep that up forever, I think.
That's what that means, sustainable.
Isn't it?
Yeah, and it's the classic where, if Pukki is going to continue scoring the rate he is at the moment, then he's
one of the best strikers
in the world. He's one of the best strikers in the world, exactly. So you have to give him a bit of leeway to say that against better defenders, it's probably unlikely he's going to continue scoring. I mean, he will still be a massive player for them next season. But in terms of players I think they need to bring in, I mean, they brought in Joseph Dermich, who had a kind of prolific spell a couple of years ago, but he's very much a target man, and I think will be either used in games where they're going to not be able to play their kind of high possession game and try and have a guy up top who can make the ball stick somewhat.
Because in terms of the way that Norwich play, would we? It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because I can both equally imagine Daniel Farke, the strength of personality and the strength of the philosophy behind what they're doing at Norwich, not being particularly willing to change how the team are playing, but also, as we mentioned with Aston Villa, and I'm sure we'll say with Sheffield United as well, it's a different context. It's a step up to a different league. Norwich won't be able to be on the front foot in the way that they have been in games throughout the past season. So, with that in mind, do you think their style of play is going to change significantly?
I think because of key personnel, it's going to be very hard for them to change the way they play, because they've got a squad full of just really technically good players. You look at their back four, which we assume will be the back four that starts next season, and you've got Max Aarons, who's 19, playing right back, who, if you're asking him to do anything that isn't, you want him to flourish and play his technical game because he's a brilliant player. Jamal Lewis, who's 21 at left back, very similar, technically very good, and then Ben Godfrey at centre back, who's 21 as well, I think. You can't ask these guys to suddenly sit deep and try and soak up pressure, because A, it's not the way that they play their game, and B, because of inexperience, realistically, it's just going to cause trouble. So
can we think of any examples of teams that have successfully made the step up, playing the type of football that they did in the Championship, which is similar to this?
The obvious one, isn't it?
Yeah.
they pretty much nailed it, right? And now they're considered to be one of the most entertaining teams in the Premier League, but
also without spending a great deal of money.
Exactly. But one thing that we'll remember from their early days in the Premier League was they always conceded a lot of goals, and thankfully they're able to score plenty as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's similar for Norwich. I mean, they weren't particularly strong defensively, I wouldn't say, in the Championship. Compared to Leeds, compared to Sheffield United, I didn't put them on the same level there. They had a couple of very strange quirks of stats and circumstance. I mean, they were behind at half time in their home league games more often than they were ahead, more often than they were drawing. So out of the 23 games, half time at Carrow Road, they were behind 8 times. They were ahead 7 times, and they were drawing 7 times. 8 times, I think it is. But they only lost, I think, twice when they were behind at half time. So there's a real resilience and a strength of character, which bodes very, very well when we talk about those intangible things that we spoke about back in the Aston Villa discussion. But there was also a propensity to concede the first goal in games where they should have been dominating. And of course, it's great that you can turn it around, but ideally you wouldn't be in that position in the first place. So the other big difference was first half versus second half. In the first half of games, in all league games, home and away, 34 goals for and 29 against, so +5 goal difference. And in the second half of games, 59 goals scored, so 25 goals more, and 28 conceded, 1 less. So a massive gap, +31 goal difference. So
I believe that the terminology the statisticians use is wanting it more. Though,
yes.
That's the case for the second half of games.
Yeah, exactly, which might not reflect what people would see if they just look at the team sheet, the nationalities of the management staff and the players. But there you go.
Yeah. Patrick Roberts has come in as well on loan. Should we have a quick chat about him? Because I expect that he will be there assisting Pookie in scoring some goals potentially. I mean, he's still very young.
Yeah, I think he's a good and necessary addition to their wide options. Yeah. They play in a 4-2-3-1 system, but Emi Buendia, who plays off the right, I would call essentially a sort of auxiliary number 10, partly because of Max Aarons, who George spoke about, who's so adept at getting forward from right back that in a possession-based system, he can more or less take up the position of a winger in possession in the final third at least.
Do you think Buendia is the sort of player who might have attracted interest and moved to a Premier League club had Norwich not been promoted? Is he of the calibre?
Yeah, I would think almost certainly.
Yeah,
because he stands out in games, right?
I think he's someone from these 3 teams we're talking about who's got the potential to go as high as he wants, really. I think people are going to wake up to how good he is very quickly.
He's so good in tight spaces. He's got such a clever footballing brain. Him and Pablo Hernandez, probably the 2, really attacking, technical, creative players of the Championship last season. And he's still very, very young, of course. But what were we discussing?
Patrick Roberts we were talking about.
That's right. So on the other side, you had really Onel Hernandez was the starting left winger. Really low centre of gravity, ball carrier, dribbler, not a massive goal threat. And certainly not an old school winger who's going to whip in a lot of crosses. That's not what he's asked to do, of course. He's asked to come inside. I think Roberts is going to give them more quality than Hernandez does. So I would expect to see him starting possibly off the left. Okay.
And in terms of obvious areas for improvement, there aren't too many as we discussed because the team is quite well balanced already, and there's a delicacy to it. Perhaps more than the other 2 teams who have been promoted, you would imagine that were Norwich to bring in too many players, that might unbalance whatever magic and cobwebs it is that has, as you say, helped them to outperform their XG significantly last season. But are there any areas beyond goalkeeper and striker, which we've already seen, that the team might improve?
I think a bit of depth wouldn't go amiss, certainly in the fullback positions.
Yeah.
They've got 4 centre-backs, of which I'd say Zimmerman, Godfrey and Closer should be fine. I'm not so sure about Grant Hanley, so maybe a 4th centre-back option. But it's difficult knowingly signing depth, knowingly signing players that aren't quite as good as the ones you have, but maybe are a bit younger. They've already got such a young team that, it's going to be interesting to see how they go about it. I mean, they've already got a lot of central midfield options and they've got a lot of different combinations they can play. I think Teti was their big sort of enforcer. In the first half of last season, pretty much lost his place halfway through, and they went with 2 pretty technical options in that double pivot. So Tribal's going to have a job on his hand as the real sort of enforcer. I'm not sure that suits him that well. Maybe a bit more of a tough tackler in those areas. But otherwise, I think we're pretty excited to see this Norwich team take on the Premier League.
Yeah, I mean, the one area I'd maybe say, we've spoken about Buendia who kind of does coming off that right hand side into that number 10 role. And Marcus Stiepermann is immensely popular with Norwich fans. But I do wonder if there's maybe, if we're talking about depth, just another option in that position there, just someone who just plays in that attacking midfield role, both as someone who can score goals and create. And just provide a bit of competition for that position. But I've mentioned that to some Norwich Sporting friends of mine who wouldn't have a bad word said about him. So
I wouldn't be surprised if they kind of pull that 10 back to more of an 8 or even an extra sort of 6 in there. So remains to be seen.
Okay, Norwich going to stay up?
Yes. I think.
That was forceful. I liked it.
I think that. I'm someone who normally would have massive alarm bells ringing when I look at the discrepancy in XG ratio to what actually happened. But I think the weight of evidence behind what Stuart Webber does and continues to do. I think just having someone who's intelligent and understands what it takes to win football matches in that role, when you've got 19 other clubs who probably don't have anyone who's that bright doing the same thing, just gives you a big advantage. And not only did what he did at Huddersfield so impressive, but just the manner from which, after he left, both recruitment and what was going on the pitch just fell away very quickly. I think he was the important one rather than David Wagner, who we have massive respect for. So long as Webber's there, and so long as people don't cotton on to the fact that they should probably be trying to get him into their club, I think they'll be fine.
The rumours were suggesting that Manchester United were trying to do just that this summer, right?
Which was after I said it on a national newspapers podcast. So
you're the reason.
Yeah, exactly.
I see.
Come at me, Norwich. Yeah.
I think there are some really interesting challenges here. How will this team cope with not being the more technically proficient team in almost all of their games? How will the defence cope with presumably having plenty of spells where they are under a lot of pressure? Will they be able to keep up this bizarre late goal scoring streak? All of these things are kind of up in the air, but without wanting to sound pessimistic, I think all of these things I have some big question marks over. The last thing is they've created this unbelievable atmosphere. The club's fans feel closer to the club than they ever have before. We know how difficult it is to stay positive when things aren't going well, and I just really, really hope that if things start slowly, if they're finding things a bit difficult to start with, it would be just desperately sad if, for whatever reason, the fan sentiment turned against either the manager or some of the players, because they have given them probably the best season of their Norwich supporting life, the modern life, I would say, and we'd love to just see that stay, even if there's tough times ahead.
Okay, let's move on to Sheffield United then. The first thing I would like to say about Sheffield United is that Luke Freeman has joined from QPR. Luke Freeman, who the only reason I know, and this is no disrespect to Luke Freeman, I don't know any footballers. The only reason I know who Luke Freeman is because Alex Stewart, who normally appears on this podcast, a few years ago did a Football Manager extended series for the set pieces. And I believe Luke Freeman was one of his Bristol City signings.
Yeah, he would have been.
Who took them all the way to the Champions League final. So that's I've got a sort of soft spot in my heart.
Another good
for Luke
fact
Freeman.
about Luke Freeman. I've done some pretty extensive research on this, and you never quite know the start, the sort of the genesis of a chant.
Yeah.
But I believe the first ever footballer whose name was put to galas freed from desire was Luke Freeman from Stevenage fans.
Wow.
Almost a decade ago. Okay. So not Will Grigg actually, but Luke Freeman.
I can't believe we've just been told two Luke Freeman facts, and neither of them were just the fact that he went to Arsenal when he was younger. I just assumed that's what you're both going to say, and then you both just didn't say it, and I was going to be bored because everyone knows that. So.
Well, he's earned his shot at the Premier League, put it that way. He was Arsenal youth, as George said, but he went all the way to the very bottom of the professional game in England, and basically has just had that really clear path. He's been very popular at every team he's been at: Stevenage, Bristol City, QPR. The last few years he's been easily the on-pitch leader in terms of, in a footballing sense certainly, and I think in a sort of psychological sense in some cases as well. In what's been a poor QPR team, he's really carried them at times, and he massively deserves his shot, and I really like that it's Sheffield United that signed him. Of any Premier League team, I think it's one that suits him. I think he can contribute a lot, and a manager that we like very much in Chris Wilder, so he's in a good place.
Okay, well this is a good time then I suppose to ask you about Chris Wilder and how does he get them to play that the way they do?
So you could write a book on George's relationship with Chris Wilder. It's a complicated affair.
Yeah, I'm an Oxford fan, and he was our manager when he took us out of the conference,
right?
And then left. I think he left us when we were about fourth in the league, And what will surprise people who've watched Sheffield United now is that the reason why Oxford fans wanted him to leave was because the football was so bad.
Right.
And yet here he is taking Sheffield United into the Premier League, playing this bizarre brand of like the 3-5-2 that no one's ever really seen before.
Yeah.
Encouraging maximum creative freedom and positional freedom from his players, which is key to how they play. I mean, people talk a lot, and I think we got quite bored towards the end of the season, people asking us about the overlapping centre-backs. Because whilst Chris Basham did marauder forward as if there was absolutely no problem with the centre-back suddenly being 40 yards up the pitch in mid-game. There are many other facets to their play that were so impressive. You're looking at someone like Ollie Norwood or John Fleck, who are two guys who were just suddenly performing at a completely different level to how they had done before in their career, both mid-20s, not young players by any stretch of the imagination at all. And Wilder just seems to have a way of looking at a squad of players and working out the best way to fit them all together. So looking at the transfers they've brought in so far this season, we talk about Freeman, who can either operate as a 10 or out wide. You look at Callum Robinson, who can either operate as a 10 or out wide. You have to wonder if maybe he's adding a few different options to his squad in order to not always play that 3-5-2, so they can shift to a 4 at the back if they need to. But he's what he's done at Sheffield United. I mean, I think if there was an award for the best EFL manager of the last 10 or so years, given what he did at Oxford and then at Northampton and then at Sheffield United, he'd be the clear winner by miles.
Wow, okay. Will you explain to me a little bit more about the positional freedom stuff? Do you need a special kind of player when you're thinking about transfers coming in who has the ability to be able to understand maybe a wider role on the pitch as it relates to what his teammates are doing? Because that lack of positional stability that we see with a lot of other teams, I suppose it requires players to have a better understanding of what everyone else is doing at once.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that in a game, when you see it, it looks, beautifully free, and as George kept saying, the word freedom, and that's what it looks like on the pitch, the rotation of positions and people moving into areas that you wouldn't expect given where they are put on a formation graphic, shall we say. But the reality is, of course, that takes quite a long time to drill on the training pitch, and actually to be able to do that, you have to be incredibly well structured, well drilled, and to really believe in what you're doing. So perhaps compared to joining another club, getting into the Sheffield United way of playing might take a bit more time. But I guess for Freeman and for Robinson, the size of this move, the importance of this move for them, and the fact that Chris Wilder would not have signed players unless they were proper workers, because that is he has many old school British manager elements to him, and also this really sort of modern way of tactical flexibility, and that's what's made him so popular and so successful in the last few years. So I think they're really good signings in that sense. We think they're going to be signing another midfielder called Ben Osborne, and he's a classic sort of, he could play left wing back, he can play central midfield, he could probably play 10 at a push, technical, hard-working, bustly, and just sort of a smart player, and it all just kind of adds up that they're just keeping a similar sort of thing.
Would you describe many of Sheffield's players or United's players as utility players in that regard then, that many of them can play those different positions, or is it just something that he's lucked out with a squad or he's had to coach into them?
I think it looks like that might be developing now. I mean, just by the couple of players he's brought in. But generally, I mean, their team was so settled last season, except, I should say, Chris Wilder loves strikers. He is just totally and utterly obsessed with signing strikers.
He's a hoarder.
Every January, even if, last season they had Billy Sharp and Dave McGoldrick in beautifully in tandem for the first half of the season. January comes and in comes Gary Medine and Scott Hogan on loan. Medine did a job in the end. I mean, Hogan was a fairly pointless signing. I mean, he just stockpiled strikers like there's no tomorrow. And at the moment, they've only got 4 strikers on their books. And they are the age 33, 31, 34 and 30. Ched Evans and Leon Clark being the two that look pretty surplus to requirements to us. So it's just Sharp and McGoldrick really at the moment. Yeah. And they're being linked to Morpay, who I mentioned earlier, who I guess would be in the mould of a Billy Sharp, really, someone who just gets on the end of chances and puts them away. And Ollie McBurney from Swansea is the other one, who's a really exciting player. Can play as a target man, very good in the air, but also really good with the ball at his feet as well and carrying it through midfield. So there'd be 2 pretty smart signings, and I guess given Wilder's adoration for strikers and the lack of both depth they have in that position at the moment, and also with the age of the players they have, we'll see a few more coming in there. I thought by the beginning of the season.
I wonder what the sort of upper limit that Sheffield United will spend on a player, because more and more we're seeing teams understand that it is likely that you will, or it is possible, shall we say, that you might get relegated again. And things will be a lot easier in 12 months' time if you haven't spent £80 million. And for an Aston Villa that brings in a lot more revenue than Sheffield United off the pitch, maybe you have a bit more to work with. But I think that we've seen teams kind of pose a threat to their long-term future by spending too much or overextending themselves in the short term. So it doesn't look like Sheffield United are doing that, and they do have a bit of an ownership, bit of shenanigans off the field that might have slowed things down a little bit. But if they could go up to 15 million quid for McBurney, I think that would be a very good way of spending that money. They scored a lot of goals from crosses last season. They're very strong from set pieces, as you sometimes expect from a team that has 3 centre backs on the pitch. It's always difficult for the opposition, especially if they've only got 2 centre backs to mark man for man and to be able to combat that. McBurney adds that height, and he does get on the end of a lot of crosses. But he's also sort of underrated because of his size, underrated ball player, and he does like to drop deep. And I think he's another player that would be very happy playing in a fairly fluid system, sort of contributing to build up play and also getting on the end of the crosses.
I think the one thing to add is if they do sign McBurney, I mean, crosses into the box. Well, I guess part of a facet with the wing backs they played last season of their play, but you would think that he would be far better in a kind of more regulation 4-2-3-1 or something like that, where you do have these wingers providing service. And so I'd like to see them add some more kind of attacking talent in wide areas personally, even if they are going to continue with the 3-5-2, just to give them more options. Said Benrahma is a player from Brentford who we think is, of their many gems, I think he's probably kind of the crown jewel, I guess, who is being linked to a few clubs. And also Joe Lolly's another one who's at Nottingham Forest, who I think is a player who's of that similar mould, who's direct, plays out wide and deserves a bit of a step up. He's been linked to Villa. So players in that mould who are wide men, who can create and score, and maybe just help out the load on the strikers.
On a broader point, do you think that maybe there's a little bit of a paradox that's been created by the inflated TV money in the Premier League for teams who are at the top of the Championship now? Because as we say with Sheffield United, for example, if they don't spend a lot of money and the directors knowingly do that, despite the fact that might or could likely lead to relegation again, but they do that knowing that they would be better placed the following season in the Championship to come back up again, and the financial health overall of the club long term might be improved by yo-yoing between the two, rather than spending a lot of money, being relegated again, and then perhaps taking 3 or 4 years like Villa did to get back up again. Does that sort of create a bit of a paradox? It's kind of a conflict with how you would expect football teams to want to run. The idea previously would always be that the higher up, the better, but that might not be true now. I
think it's the sort of thing that would keep me up at night if I was involved within a club, that balance, as you mentioned. And from a fan point of view as well, it's really difficult to marry up the mid to long term and the short term, because you desperately want to go and feel like the team you're going to support has been given the best chance to succeed on a short-term basis, whether that's match to match or season to season. But I think, and especially from Sheffield United fans they've seen the Premier League in, what was it, probably 15 years ago now, maybe more. They've also been down to League One, so they've kind of seen a bit of everything. And, you know, when I think of other teams that have done that and now back up in the Premier League, the likes of Southampton, I suspect they might be less quick to sort of get a bit antsy and start saying, why didn't we spend more? Why didn't we show more ambition? But that only lasts for so long, because it can be difficult. If you feel like they could have spent a bit more, it's an easy thing. It's an easy stick to beat someone with if the season's not going well. Yeah.
Okay. The last question on United then, will they be staying up?
I think that I've been back and forth on this. Early in the summer, I thought that they were unfairly seen as the favourites to go down. I think now they probably are the most likely of the three to get relegated. But anyone who thinks that they're going to be the whipping boys, and anyone who thinks that it's as dead set they're going to get relegated, I think will be in for a shock. I think that they could be a team who surprise a couple of people early on in the season who maybe take them lightly, because Chris Wilder will have them, I mean, in technical terms, bang up for it, I think is the way you put it. So I think they'll They might ruffle a few feathers, but I think they probably are the most likely of the three to return to the Championship.
I think they will finish the highest of the three promoted teams. I think that they have the least amount of stylistic compromise to make, which is a sentence I didn't think I'd ever say out loud.
You're on the Tifo Football Podcast,
yeah,
Ali.
exactly.
It all goes here.
I think I'm sitting in Alex Stewart's seat as well.
You are.
I'm really trying my best.
He demands the good camera, by the way, just as you did this
Really?
morning. So there's a lot of similarities
Fair
between the
enough.
two of your
Normally
characters.
on our podcast, I just say things are good or bad, and we'll pretty much stop at that. No, I think they have the least amount to change, really, because the very nature of their system, they can, if they're under the cosh, they have a flat back five if they need to, and that's a good start. They can drop the number 10 back into midfield and give themselves a few more bodies in those central areas. They can move one of the two strikers maybe out wide and play more of a, the sort of thing that Wolves played when they won promotion, that Chelsea played under Conte, with two sort of inside forwards. They've got a lot of things they can do, I think, to react to whatever the opposition's doing. And I think they will be more comfortable. We go back to those intangibles, the gritty stuff, overcoming spells of pressure, the sort of leadership quality that Wilder has, and that grit and stuff. I kind of believe in that to some extent. So I'm feeling quite good about Sheffield United. I'm just a little concerned whether they're going to be able to score as many goals as they did last season.
Mm-hmm.
But
I would say overall then, judging on your answers, do correct me if I'm wrong, that you are both, as a combined unit, least confident of Aston Villa, most confident of Norwich City, and middling with slightly different opinions on Sheffield United. Is that accurate?
it's strange when you say it out loud, isn't it?
We'll see how we'll tell you on first day of the season once we know what the squads are. But yeah, I mean, that's
I've
about
got a
right
couple
for
of
me.
politicians here. I really do.
Well, it's difficult because we obviously we follow these teams are the best teams in the leagues that we cover. The teams that we talked about every week, practically for about 6 months.
Minus Leeds, right?
Well, yeah, the other one was Leeds. Teams that won the majority of their matches, played good football, had players that were thriving, and in all the teams of the year. It's also within our interest to sort of say that they're going to be really, really good, because we believe that the Championship is a strong division, and we don't want it to be as easy as they go up and they come straight back down again. But I think we do also believe in the reality that it's a big step up, and it's very, very difficult to stay up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of the Championship and the EFL generally as strong leagues, I asked you guys, and you very kindly agreed to inform Tifo listeners as to a few names, for example, of players who you think might be prime for a place within the Premier League, or also I think we've got a list here that you provided with Ali of players who've already moved to bigger clubs.
Yeah, it's kind of all the names that immediately sprung to mind.
Yeah.
I realised that while we've been on holiday, the majority of them have moved to the Premier League, which is a huge blow. And actually, some of the other ones played for Norwich, so
right.
Their young fullbacks really caught the eye, and Godfrey as well. So a lot of the the standout, let's say, sub 23-year-old players from the Championship last season and a couple from League One have got moves to the Premier League. So it's a shame for us because now we have to find new ones.
But it is an indication of the strength that you were just talking about, right? I mean, if they're being sort of swallowed up whole as we're just talking about.
I think there's also now, I mean, going back to what you were saying about the financial discrepancy between the leagues, it's getting to a stage now where Premier League clubs can afford. It used to be the the levy on English players and whatever, and you charge more for them. But you look at something like the Craig Dawson transfer from West Brom to Watford, where West Brom is suddenly getting £6 million for a player who was good for them, but was in his late 20s, who they can reinvest into, if they're wise about it, into youth and into multiple first team players. Whereas for Watford, they're getting a solid centre back for £6 million. It's a great deal. It's so cheap. So I think that's why we're maybe seeing more freedom of movement between the Premier League and the Championship. And someone like James Justin, who's gone to Leicester from Luton for 10 or so million quid. I mean, his ceiling is so high. A fantastic footballer, played left back for Luton, but naturally is a right back. And for 10 million quid for a club just promoted from League One, I mean, it's huge money. But for Leicester, it's an absolutely fantastic signing, because he's a ready-made Premier League player now at the age of 21. So. Right. I think we'll continue to see this, and we're just crossing our fingers that all these guys go on and do good stuff in the Premier League.
Yeah. It feels like if a handful of these guys make an impact immediately or over the course of the next 12, 24 months, and this is going to just become a sort of feeding frenzy every summer with the sort of maybe not the top teams. I know United signed Daniel James and Spurs signed Jack Clark, but I see it as your Leicesters, who appear to be trying to build a team of under 23-year-old English players. Those are the teams that are just going to snap up anyone available for £10 million, which is not much to them, but an awful lot for a Championship team or a League One team. So I think it's something we could see more of. Of course, if the step up is too big, and if these guys that we've been hyping up all this time end up being no more than sort of average squad players, then that pathway might close off. It's all about trends in football, isn't it?
At the risk of being reductive, who's the best player on your list?
Don't be reductive.
On the list of players who've already gone, or just...
Yeah,
I don't think I've actually shown George the list.
No, so
No.
George can see the list here.
I'd say of those players, the one who'll have the best career, probably Justin.
James Justin.
James Justin,
Yep.
yeah.
Okay.
I am really excited to see Che Adams playing in the Premier League. I think he will be playing quite a lot immediately, which is a good start. I think Justin's got a bit more to break into that Leicester team than Adams does in the Saints team. And I just think he's someone that people are going to be really impressed to see. I think he's going to score some goals.
Okay. Hey, guys, thanks so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. Would you tell listeners quickly where they can find you individually, not at your homes,
Southwest
Twitter,
London. No.
and the podcast as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which we will link in the description of the video and the podcast.
That's very kind. We would love it if some of the people who enjoyed listening to some EFL chat fancied giving us a go. We're doing a lot of pre-season content at the moment, which is just ramping up. I'll sort of, it's a big few weeks for us, obviously, before the start of the season. So there'll be plenty going on. It'd be a good way to get involved.
And you're on Sky TV all the time.
We are on Sky TV some of the time.
It's very exciting.
It is exciting.
Yeah.
I know. It's quite scary sometimes, isn't it?
I imagine it would be.
Yeah, I sweat a lot. It's
Yeah.
just, but,
Right. Me too, man.
It's hard to know what
I
to do
know.
with your hands on
Right.
occasion. Anyway,
This thing.
we are on Twitter at NTT20pod, and we do like to hear from people if they are nice. So please do.
Your solo Twitter name is the Makalele Roll.
Yes.
Isn't it? Any reason why?
Yes.
Not an EFL player.
Back in the day, the early Twitter days, a lot of people will know the ones I'm talking about. It was a simpler time, that's for sure.
It was.
And I was about 17, 18, 19, and I did what everyone did, and I set up a blog, and all the good names were taken. And I am a childhood Chelsea fan.
Yeah.
And Claude Makalele very much for me the linchpin of one of Chelsea's, or certainly the best Chelsea team I've seen in my lifetime.
although
So
he was an EFL coach briefly
he was an EFL
at
coach.
Swansea, so not totally off brand.
So
Right,
that's where that's
okay.
come from. And now it feels a bit weird because sometimes, like Sky Sports News will send a clip that we've been in, and it'll
Sure.
say the Makalele row, and you think that it looks wrong.
Is
and
it
yet,
is it too late to change it now, do you think? I mean, I like it. I don't think you should
I
change
think
it.
the general consensus from the OG followers would be that it would be a genuine disaster.
Yeah.
But
I love that you think people care that much.
I actually, anyway, it will get changed at some point.
And you are just at George Ellick, aren't you?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Straightforward.
ELEK.
Simple. I like it.
Capital G, capital E, yeah.
Guys, thank you so much.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
Cheers.
Have a lovely day, and
Thanks.
we'll be back again next week. I think Alex will be back by then, and we'll probably be doing some more sensible transfers. So see you soon. Thank you. Bye bye.